What is seasteading in the most literal sense?
A seastead is a homestead on the high seas. What's unique about seasteads is they would float permanently at sea. You would never come to land, and these would eventually become startup societies.
This is about establishing more voluntarist lifestyles than would have previously been thought possible.
Seasteaders are putting all their own skin in the game. We're not getting tax money. We're not asking for grants. We're going to build these things ourselves. We're going to run our own businesses. We're going to do it before the eyes of the world. It would unleash evolution in the most important service in the world, which is governance. You want to be in a situation where you don't even know what the politics are and you don't even know who the captain is. All you need is the power to choose something else, and then the governance will improve.
The Seasteading Institute, as its name would suggest, promotes seasteading, an ambitious and wildly original plan to set up societies on artificially constructed islands. While the push to advance this kind of ecosystem is driven mainly by libertarian, anti-government principles, seasteading also supports environmental and humanitarian causes. Despite this, it still remains a polarizing concept to many people. This is episode 19 of Morgan Meets the Eye, in which the president of the Seasteading Institute, Joe Quirk, and I discuss what seasteading is, what has been done so far by the Institute, and its momentous implications for the future. Joe Quirk, thanks for joining the show. Now, before we get into today's discussion, where should my listeners go to learn more about seasteading and the Seasteading Institute?
If you Google seasteading, you will get the Seasteading Institute. And if you look at my book on Amazon, Seasteading, you will find the truth about seasteading. If you Google almost any press about it, you will be misinformed.
Oh, yes.
And the evidence that we're making headway is in the fact that so many journalists are compelled to say negative, wrong things.
Yes. So definitely much better to learn about it from the source itself.
Yes. Any question you can possibly ask about seasteading has been answered in like a 2-minute video on our YouTube channel. So you can really take a deep dive.
Yes. So anybody listening, definitely make sure to check out, seasteading.org and, check out any information that they have listed there, because you'll find it very, very informative. So on the topic of seasteading, though, I do realize that there are many philosophical, political, and ideological implications behind this idea. But before we get into that, I think it would make more sense to ask, what is seasteading in the most literal sense? So that is, I can describe a houseboat or a cruise ship in very straightforward terms, and people do live on them at sea, but how would seasteading compare and contrast with these things? What would somebody need to know in order to be able to correctly point out and identify a seastead, for example?
Well, a seastead is a homestead on the high seas. Most of the world's surface is ocean, and probably 45% of the Earth's surface is completely unclaimed by any nation state. And if instead of thinking about going to Mars, we should think about colonizing this planet, which should be called Planet Ocean, not Planet Earth. And what's unique about seasteads is they would float permanently at sea in the best case scenario. You would never come to land. And these would eventually become startup societies. So I think of it as a Silicon Valley sensibility brought to the problem of governments sucking, which is, if you think we're going to solve problems by startups, you can think of seasteads as the mobile phone answer to Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard was a virtual monopoly, not quite. Steve Wozniak worked there. He had this idea for the personal computer. He was rejected 5 times, presenting it on 5 separate occasions to Hewlett-Packard. They said, why would individuals want computers? It makes no sense. We don't believe that could ever work. So he broke away, founded Apple with Steve Jobs, and now we all use personal computers. And if Hewlett-Packard had a complete coercive monopoly over all computers, the rest of us probably wouldn't believe that personal computers could exist. And seasteads are a realistic technology to provide people with their own personal startup government.
One of the things I noticed you were touching on there that really sticks out to me is that one of the most striking aspects about seasteading, I would say, is its practicality. We can discuss liberty and freedom and the abolition of the state as much as we like, but until we actually take action, until we take steps to weaken the government's control over us, nothing is really going to change. So yes, this takes libertarian principles and puts them into practice, as it were. So, for instance, I know that you called for 10,000 startups on the Blue Frontier, to be exact, putting the practical before the theoretical arguments for liberty. So, on that note, I mean, this is clearly a complex endeavor in terms of engineering. So, for example, in terms of structural and technical matters, what would make a seastead safe? If I were out on a seastead, would I be rocking and wobbling around much like a regular boat would? What would protect it from elements, for example, such as large waves or storms? Would it be particularly susceptible in such an instance?
The first thing to understand about seasteading is that it's actually not that hard. And you can wrap your mind around this if you think about structures that are already in use on the sea. So the oil and gas industry already has things called flotels that float at sea, where hundreds of people can stay there for months at a time, and they get so much stability in high waves. They can play ping pong, they can play pool, they can sometimes take a bridge over to the oil rig they're working on. So if you think of, pillars as the symbolic foundation of civilization, you can actually make a pillar in the sea. Ocean folk call it a spar, but in order to translate this for land folk, I call it a sea pillar. It seems impossible that you could just nail a pillar into the ocean and it would be as stable as a fence post. But it's true. Waves are mostly caused by the wind, and most of the perturbations that cause problems in seasickness are at the surface. But if you go down deep, it's surprisingly stable. The oceans are, the fish that migrate go down a certain level so they can have complete stability. Now, if you send if you put most of the weight at the bottom of your pillar, deep beneath the waves, that's called ballast. And that can create a lot of stability on which you can put your little house on one pillar. And this is a known technology that's in use all the time. And to illustrate this principle, one time I was in a hot tub and I made a little YouTube on video where I took a wine bottle and I emptied out the wine bottle. I filled the bottom with about an inch or two of sand. I stuck the cork back in the top. I put it in the hot tub. I balanced a rubber ducky on top, and then I made waves. And the thing held perfectly still and the rubber ducky didn't fall off. And people are looking at it saying that must be a trick. It must be sitting on the bottom of the hot tub or something. It's like, no, it's about 3 feet from the bottom, and it stays perfectly still for waves going this way. And you're illustrating this ballast principle. And if the bottle is empty, you're creating, no, I can't remember what it's called, buoyancy. So with the right ratio of buoyancy to weight, you can build just about anything on top of this thing. And it's already done all over the oceans on behalf of the oil and gas industry very expensively. And the reason it's so expensive is that most of the oil is in areas of the ocean that are very high waves, like the North Sea.
Yes.
So you have to build a tremendous amount of stability. And what land folk don't realize is that the oceans are as diverse as the land. Just as in the North Sea, you can compare that to the Himalayas. And the doldrums near the equator, you can compare that to the Sahara Desert. So there around the Earth at the equator, there's like 1,000-mile wide band of very calm seas where waves in the worst conditions have never been recorded to get higher than 5 meters. So basically, you could take what we already have in high wave conditions on the North Sea, the spar, as it's called, or the sea pillar. You could build that at 1/100th the size, stick it in equatorial seas, and instead of a wind turbine or a flotel, you can put a house on it. Seasteaders are trying to get this to be cheaper than the average home in the U.S. Once you have one of these, now imagine 4 spars and a platform on top of it. You have something as stable as a table. You could have this on the high seas. If it remained at sea permanently, it would essentially serve as a startup government. Now, or at least that gets more complicated. But you have boats and flotels and oil platforms have a surprising amount of self-governance. As an example of this, I always use the example of cruise ships. Anytime people talk about all the things that's going to go wrong and all the anarchy you would descend into, I say cruise ships have already ascended into anarchy. They're fundamentally self-governing structures. And if I'm on a cruise ship in Alaska and it's flagged in Panama and a crime takes place or an elderly person has a heart attack, we have to deal with it on that ship. I can't call 911 back to Panama. So these cruise ships are de facto self-governing, and a population larger than Texas boards these things every year for self-governance at sea. Often, the average age of cruise ship people is quite old, and often they're very elderly people. So everything that happens in your land city happens on cruise ships. It all happens, and it all has to be dealt with by hospitals on board, by helicopters that are in striking distance to emergency hospitals on land, by private security on board, all run by a captain who is a dictator. A captain is de facto a dictator at sea. And the question becomes, well, why doesn't he make criminals walk the plank? Why doesn't he flog his crew? Why doesn't he keel haul the customers? And it's like, well, because the customers and the employees have the choice to switch to other cruise lines. So no one thinks about this, but the cruise ship industry, the cargo ship industry, the entire flagging system, maritime flags on the sea, are functionally a system for decentralized self-governance on the sea, which is very complex with many overlapping jurisdictions. And it all works and creates a lot of prosperity in the case of cruise ships. And seasteaders are simply proposing, if you build something like this at 1/1000th the size, at 1/10,000th the cost, and you're able to float it at sea permanently, what is its status on the sea? Could we flag these the same way cruise ships are flagged and unleash a technology for self-governance on the sea and rapidly proliferate these much faster than cruise ships proliferated all over the sea? What I love about seasteading is that it gets beneath all these arguments that we have about how a society should be run. And I think the first step to freedom is to free your mind. So even if you love liberty, if we liberty-loving people are honest with ourselves, we spend a lot of time arguing with people who want more state control. And I think the very idea that we're going to argue our way to a government solution is itself the fallacy. There is no you and I think you and I have a lot of overlap in our beliefs. And then you and I are going to figure out the right way society should be run. And then all we have to do is get our allies together, get control of the government, and then impose our will on everybody else, and then it will all work. Recently, I watched a debate between the anarchists and the minarchists, which is going to work. And they both argue about what's going to go wrong with their own system. And I'm listening to this saying the entire debate is moot because there is no arguing for the best system in your mind and then imposing that on reality.
Exactly.
Societies evolve, and all you ever have is the adjacent possible. You have to move to something realistic that's next to what you already have. You need to make lots of mistakes, and most of those are disasters, and some of them are an improvement, and then you need a system by which those people can choose. And what I love about seasteading is that it frees our mind because it's a technology for you to demonstrate your ideology in practice. And it's all done voluntarily. And every ideology should love it. You and I should love it because it's voluntary. Progressives should love it because it allows progress in governance peacefully. Conservatives should love it because it's a way that people on their own initiative can found their own societies on the frontier and pay the consequences and get the profits if it succeeds. It's a technology to unleash the only way governments have ever progressed, which is evolution, variation and selection among governance providers by citizens, which we can't predict what would happen, but we know in principle it would unleash evolution in the most important service in the world, which is governance. And then we can argue about politics as often as cruise ship passengers argue about who should be the captain on the ship. You want to be in a situation where you don't even know what the politics are and you don't even know who the captain is. All you need is the power to choose something else, and then the governance will improve. Where no angels are involved, no virtuous people need to be voted in. It's just open, decentralized competition. And what's counterintuitive to the doubters is how easily this can be done technologically. And all the problems are rapidly getting solved by the 11 seasteading enterprises we've inspired so far at our nonprofit, because the more you explain this to people, the more people see, yes, this is the path forward for liberty. It's the path forward for governance innovation. It's also the path forward for business profit. Cruise ships are just making more and more money every year and growing and growing and growing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And more people are choosing to vacation in private governance at sea. They never change their ideologies. That's one of the ways I changed my way of thinking, is I noticed the first cruise ship I was ever on, I noticed it was the highest standard of living I've ever had. And it was cheaper than the coastal hotel I'd stayed in the night before. And I was saying, why am I so much wealthier for so much less on this cruise ship? And why are all these people from Indonesia and Thailand working on the cruise ship? Why don't they stay in their countries and work? Why do they get on this thing and work so enthusiastically? Why is it better for everybody and yet it's cheaper? It would take me a while to figure out it's because of the decentralized competition among self-governing floating cities at sea.
I do notice, as far as the cruise ship example that you were positing there, I do see some parallels between that and certain thinkers such as Hans Hermann Hoppe, for example, who's, written on essentially some of the comparisons between, monarchy, which could be essentially, the captain of the cruise ship being similar to a monarch in that sense, versus some of the pitfalls that arise from a democratic government, for example. And I do know this is something of a controversial topic among libertarians, but it is one that I do think that this cruise ship example does illustrate to a sense. And going back to what you were talking about as far as the stability of these structures, I do see that I do know for a fact that the Seasteading Institute has uploaded certain footage of people doing what was considered the red wine test, the martini test, where even in very stormy weather, they would fill a wine glass all the way up to the brim, and no ripples would be visible. It was showing complete stability, even in this, unfortunate weather that they were in. So with that in mind, it does go to show that, the Seasteading Institute, the proof is essentially in the pudding there, and that they are showing that there is some level of stability. But I do know there that you touched upon a lot of the, freedom and libertarian principles that are at play here. So I do see that it's very easy to see the concept of seasteading as people living out in their homes and cities on the ocean and taking that simply on face value. But I do think that doing this seems to miss the bigger picture, as it were, which is, why are these seasteads being constructed in the first place? And fundamentally, this is about establishing more voluntarist lifestyles than would have previously been thought possible, which is something you were touching on there. For example, if you don't like your neighbors, you're not required to stay with them. Moving becomes a much, much easier process. There's much less paperwork, much less, it's much less of a struggle, and it's much faster. Or on the other hand, if you don't want to pay taxes to the government, what government is there to pay taxes to in the first place out in these, in these waters that do not belong to any government? So I'm personally very pleased to see a form of technological innovation that genuinely grants individuals a level of autonomy that would have been, inconceivable prior to this point, and one that's genuinely changing the very nature, the very shape of our interpersonal relations. But anyway, I'm curious as to what role individualist and libertarian principles played when conceiving of the seasteading movement. Was that the main driving force, or was it only a secondary coincidental benefit that arose from this idea as it was going along?
I was not the founder of the Seasteading Institute. I discovered it probably 3 years later and started writing the book about it probably 4 years after that, or something like that. And I've probably been the face of the Seasteading Institute for 13 years. So I can tell you about why I became so devoted to it. I do know it's a technology for liberty, but even more vitally for innovation in governance. And we call it the blue frontier because we think of it as a frontier where people can go experiment with new societies voluntarily. And I think of it as evolving much like the Western frontier in North America. So initially, you're going to have the fanatics, the people getting in their covered wagon, who are sick of the old society and they're willing to suffer, and they're going to go out there and build a log cabin. And maybe they have some bizarre religion or bizarre belief where they want freedom. And then they're going to go out there and they're going to establish their own society. And then eventually some sort of entrepreneur is going to say, hey, they need a hardware store because every time they drop something, it goes to the bottom of the sea or something like that. So somebody who's not, maybe things aren't working for them in their old society, will go out there and maybe set up a hardware store. I'm just talking theoretically. Someone from the developing world will say, I can get a better job working for that guy at the hardware store than I can in my poorly governed country. So then I'm going to move out there. It won't take long before all sorts of people of all different ideologies are moving to seasteads as they become more comfortable, simply because it's a better life. And people who say, oh, I don't believe in what those seasteaders believe in, but I do live on one and I am going to have my children on one. And so I think it will scale up that way. And the more we can proliferate these, the more we can show how beneficent it is. It's not a threat to anybody. And if they fail, you can laugh at the fiascos, but we might learn something about what's discovered about how people can live together out there. Am I zeroing in on your core question?
Oh, yes. And I'm very glad you brought up the concept of westward expansion. The Old West is an example that is frequently brought up as something akin to a Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist society, whereas some people will argue that, well, since it's America, there's still a state, but historically the state's presence was non-existent in that area at that time in history, and it was still a very functional area. And yes, I do know that, Patry Friedman, is the founder of the Seasteading Institute. And I do think that does speak volumes considering, his family's connections, for example. He is the son of David Friedman, an anarcho-capitalist thinker, and the grandson of the very famous limited government economist Milton Friedman. And as someone who I'm sure knows him very well, I'm kind of curious, what specific principles motivated Patry to launch this institute, or what exactly was the goal he was trying to bring about?
Patry wrote a blog about how movement among city blocks would allow choice among people who want to um, choose a new government, with this simple insight that most of this earth is a frontier where we can have free societies. What I found very seductive about all this was the family legacy. So Milton Friedman was talking about all the mechanisms he could imagine by which people could choose different governments and how this would be a good thing. Probably most famously, school vouchers, where if you could create competition among schools for parents and children, school governance would improve. David Friedman has this amazing paragraph in his classic book, The Machinery of Freedom, which I quote in the Seasteading book, which is he asks you to imagine, what if houses were on wheels and people could move about and choose the neighbors we want? What if we didn't have borders? Excuse me. People could move about, choose different governments, and if the leader of your little country declared a war, he might, wake up the next day and realize the only people left in his country are, a few correspondents, or he came up with a little joke about the people that would still be there. And this would discipline your government because they're always worried people will leave. And what I found incredible about seasteading is that it's a mechanism to bring about what David Friedman talked about. And the way I put it is Milton Friedman advocated the freedom of choice. David Friedman advocated a machinery of freedom. And then Patry Friedman proposes a machinery of freedom to choose, which is exactly what seasteading is. So that to me was a irresistible 3-generation legacy of ideas ending in a practical application of their ideas that I really wanted to emphasize in the messaging of seasteading.
Yes.
So no question. People who love liberty were the first to become passionate about seasteading.
I do see, that our own society, considering many of the issues that we face as far as in the business world, among entrepreneurs, among things like that, it's certainly not, it's certainly, it's certainly a reasonable thing to believe that as time goes by and seasteads are established, I mean, let's say if somebody's seeking medical care, for example, they could very well be able to receive better medical care simply by taking a ferry 20 minutes offshore to a seastead, to perhaps a hospital that's been established, than they would receiving it on land, considering many of the constraints that have been placed. And speaking of these constraints, I'm kind of curious about when the Seasteading Institute was being established, what type of bureaucratic legal red tape, for example, did you and your cohorts essentially have to overcome in getting this organization established?
It's a nonprofit domiciled in the U.S. and in California. I didn't establish it, but I became president of it. And I think getting it established isn't nearly as challenging as getting seasteading established legally on the ocean. And that's the next challenge for the Seasteading Institute, which we're entering right now. So you can get a flag for a boat, you can get a flag for a flotel, you can get a flag for a barge, you can get a flag for a spar. There is no legal designation for a vessel that remains at sea permanently. So the Seasteading Institute is petitioning flagging registries to flag a new type of vessel. Not a boat, not a barge, not a flotel, but a seastead. And we've learned that in order to get that done, we have to go through a three-step process. You asked about safety. A respectable certification society has to certify the seastead as safe. The certification societies that already exist are so focused on existing structures, I'm not sure any of them has an incentive to certify seasteads. So the ambition of my team of volunteers is for the Seasteading Institute to become its own certification society. So if we can hire naval architects to certify the first few seasteads as, yes, this is safe, bring your children to come stay on it, it's in calm equatorial waters, it's got everything you would need to keep it safe, we hope a marine insurer would be willing to insure it. And then if that happens, we hope we can bring those new rules for a new vessel called a seastead to any of the flagging registries that already flag vessels like this and say, would you designate a new type of structure, a seastead, and flag it? In my opinion, once we have a seastead that is certified as safe, insured, and flagged by any flagging registry, seasteading is off and running. The challenge is that will be a bit of an onerous process. There's no real economic incentive for the first of the 10 or 11 seasteading companies to go through all the work to establish a flag for seasteads when their competitors will immediately swoop in and pay a few $1,000s and get a flag. So I think the service of flagging seasteads should be provided by the nonprofit, not least of which, because I personally have an interest in controlling the designation and the imprimatur. Because the thing about frontiers is they attract mavericks, and I want this to be done safely. And I want the Seasteading Institute to be in a position to say, no, we did not certify that unsafe structure by that maverick, risky guy. Yes, we did certify this structure as safe, and we stake our reputations on it, just like any other certification society. Come build your medical practice here. Come bring patients here. They will be safe, whatever the insurance company is required. So this is where the rubber meets the road, even though I'm trying to do away with all land analogies when it comes to seasteading. We're solving the technical problems. People have lots of business ideas, but now we need legal recognition by the international community that seasteads are legit, they're professional, they're not weird, and they're safe for your family. So that's the next thing the Seasteading Institute is earnest to evolve into. I want to stop just being about messaging and research and start being about certifying actual seasteads as safe so they can be flagged.
And it does pang me to hear, that certification societies would be unwilling to certify these kinds of sea-based structures. But I'm not surprised because, unfortunately, I do know that what many people consider practical is often erroneously conflated with what currently exists. I mean, there are a lot of people who will argue for the status quo in order to kind of suppress innovation and social change. And they tend to do this on the grounds that, well, what exists already works. And so, yes, I mean, many less open-minded people will hear about seasteading and they might dismiss it as science fiction. But in these cases, I do like to point out that virtually every technological advancement that humanity has made was considered science fiction before it became, for lack of a better term, science fact. So, yes, I do see that there is something of an uphill battle there. But really, I've noticed that, there's also, like you've spoken to in the past, something of an environmental aspect to this as well, something that can really benefit society from a lot of the most pressing issues that it faces currently. For example, unmanned oil rigs are functionally quite similar to seasteaded territories. So I do know that the nonprofit organization Eco Rigs has reported that unmanned oil rigs gather 10 times the quantity of fish that the Flower Gardens Fish Sanctuary does. And to be clear, I'm talking about quantity of fish per unit area. So anyway, the point I'm making here is that both the rigs and the seasteads function in a very similar way. And specifically, uh, specifically what I'm trying to say here is that these seasteads tend to create something of a circular food chain. They both function to increase life in the ocean, and this is ideal for aquaculture. This is something that I really do think that, in light of this, environmentalists would champion this movement a lot more than they actually have. And I have something of a theory on this, and at the risk of sounding cynical, I do think it comes down to the fact that seasteading is an entirely free market solution. I mean, typically, the course of action that a lot of environmentalists take is to lobby the government to pass legislation restricting how much pollution could be produced or emitted, or which particular chemicals can be used, and perhaps to impose higher fines and penalties for the entrepreneurs that don't follow these results. However, in this particular case, we have private actors within the free market who are functioning, to create this type of circular process that aids the environment as it uses it. And I simply believe that because there's not so much of a government presence in the solution, that might turn some people off. They might see that as something that could potentially be left unrestrained. But I do believe that this demonstrates a level of ignorance about the nature of supply and demand within a free market society. But anyway, putting all of that aside, I'm just curious what your thought is, what your personal take is on a lot of the opposition that you faced from different factions within society regarding seasteading.
Everything you argue about in politics can be solved by seasteading. And seasteaders can offer environmentalists a much better deal than argue with the government to control polluters, which is that every seastead you build increases the amount of life on the ocean. Fish love things that are permanently floating at sea. Coral loves things that are permanently at sea. That organization, Eco Rigs, requires a complete paradigm shift in how people think about things. They look at oil rigs and say, oh, look, isn't it ugly? And don't realize that most of the ocean is a lifeless desert. And as soon as there's something solid out there, life starts to attach to it. And in a very short order, an ecosystem starts to grow on this thing. And so when the oil rig is being decommissioned, suddenly environmentalists are motivated to say, don't tear that thing down, don't decommission it. We have a massive amount of coral and fish and things that have made it their home, and they're breeding there, and it's just getting more and more rich, and scuba divers love to go there and look at it. So imagine if you're living on a seastead, you can point to any environmentalist who lives on land and say, man, when you built your land home, you had to destroy life on that spot in order to build your foundation. But when I built my foundation on the sea, I provided a home for life to cling to. And it won't take long before seasteads will be declared like the Flower Garden Sanctuary. Like, this is too valuable, too rich with life, that to tear it down would be destroying an ecosystem. So seasteads are a way to pull carbon out of the ocean with the coral that naturally will grow on it. It's a way to provide homes for life. A lot of people are trying to restore life to the ocean by building solid structures made of steel in the ocean so that coral will grow on it, and then mussels will attach to it, and oysters will attach to it. And if you have an underwater room on your seastead, you can look out your window at your coral garden that will be growing more rich every day. And this is a natural process that happens on solid structures all over the sea. Now, the thing I haven't spoken about, the key problem that needs to be solved with seasteads, is they need to stay out there forever. And the ocean is very corrosive. It's especially corrosive to steel. So how do you solve this problem? There's only one way to solve the problem. The most practical way to solve the problem is to grow coral on it. You run a an electrical current through your steel, a very well-known process known as the Wolff-Hilberth process. This will attract calcium carbonate out of the ocean, which will attach to your seastead and rapidly encase it in a seashell, which is the same thing that is coral. So before you know it, you have coralcrete growing on your seastead. Now the steel in your seastead is protected. Now you have something that conceivably can last for centuries at sea, floating. And it can also easily be towed about without damaging the life on it, depending on how far you go. So this seasteading is a complete paradigm shift where you move beyond this sustainability idea. Sustainability is an old 20th century idea. In the 21st century, it's time for eco-restoration. That's why I use puns like civilization, trying to pop people out of their assumptions they bring to land-based governments and to civilization. In civilization, every society you create will increase the amount of life on the ocean and restore the environment. That's a pretty good deal.
Yes. And, you talking about this distinction between sustainability and eco-restoration, it does make me see seasteading as an example of the economic concept of creative destruction, in which, as we are creating and advancing our society, this does render certain ideas, certain methods of, doing things basically obsolete. But this is not a bad thing. This is creating, this is creating a net good overall. So yes, I do see, very well that there is, definitely some type of environmentalist benefit to seasteading. And I do want to make clear as well an important distinction that when I speak of environmentalism, I'm using this term in a distinctly different context than many others use it. I mean, in their case, for example, when they speak of protecting the environment, they tend to advocate a very thinly veiled primitivism, where they essentially advocate, for example, that resources that could benefit man should simply be left alone and unused. Now, where seasteading differs from this is that it does make use of the environment. It does capitalize on its surroundings. But instead of simply ruining these natural resources, instead of consuming them and producing nothing in return, the free market here does, in fact, produce something of benefit to the environment. So it's by its very use of the environment that it's able to actually save the environment. In fact, from what I've read and studied on this subject, I think it's no exaggeration to say that for man to construct seasteads and to live on the oceans is the way to repair the ocean from the damage that has been done to it by treating it as common property as opposed to private property. And that actually leads me to another matter that I wanted to speak of, which is the tragedy of the commons, which is a problem that is something that tends to arise by the very treatment of the ocean as private property, as common property rather. So in that case, how do you think, for example, that by essentially privatizing the ocean as it were, could potentially benefit our society as it currently exists and solve many of the problems that we are already facing as a result of keeping the ocean as this common property as it is currently?
Yeah, I mean, the oceans being common property that nobody owns, a giant commons, creates an incentive for everyone to get out there and just scoop up all the fish they can because there's no consequences to them. But if I have a seastead and I'm living in a certain area of the ocean, I have quite an interest in not having pollution in my backyard. Also, I'm naturally going to have a fish farm. What's amazing about that first seastead is that fish started to congregate around it. You don't even need a fish cage, and they could fish off the side of their seastead. It's called a fish aggregation device. But if you have property rights on the ocean, then anyone with a seastead has ownership incentive to take care of what's around them, especially if they're selling, say, the first business I think a seastead will be, which will be a CB&B. You want tourists to come out and dive around your seastead and look at the lovely coral that's growing on your seastead and look at the lovely fish that's on your seastead. But if you're just a boat passing through that thing, you might have an incentive to just secretly throw your trash overboard. We know this happens all the time. If I have a fish farm on my seastead, I'm going to be incentivized to manage that fish farm, not just rape it for everything I possibly can and get things out. So I think the emergence of property rights on the ocean developed piecemeal over time and scaling up among seasteads can be nothing but good for the ocean. So the biggest problems with the ocean, I think, are among the biggest problems are the acidification of the oceans. By allowing coral to grow on your seasteads, you're drawing calcium carbonate out of the ocean and storing coral. You're storing coral on your ocean. Overfishing, I think seasteads could solve that problem, at least in the area around the seastead. The more incentives you have through property rights to preserve the ocean, the better it will be for the ocean. And I think people will want to preserve the environments around their seasteads as much as economies in charge of coral reefs want to preserve the environment there.
Yes, very well said there. I've seen a lot of the artist conceptions of what a lot of these more advanced, seasteads would hypothetically look like, and I do see them as very aesthetically striking. There's definitely a kind of beauty to that a lot of people may see, and I think it could certainly draw a lot of people in. Now, with that said, I'm also curious about how, there's certainly some type of pushback against the idea of seasteading and the fact that it's really that some people who live on them would just be isolated hermits trying to escape society, trying to live some type of, completely self-dependent existence where really they're not functioning, they're not assisting anybody else, they're doing everything for themselves. And I'm curious, how much accuracy there is to this. How much accuracy is there to this notion that people who live on seasteads are simply just antisocial in that sense?
So even isolated hermits who want to get away from society are a market.
Yes.
But if you compare it to, say, a cabin in the woods by a lake, 50 miles from any neighbor, that person in that cabin still prospers through trade with the rest of the world. That's the way everything works. So if he's going to have to provide a unique service that he can sell to have Amazon come deliver things to him. And I like to tell this joke. I briefly met Jeff Bezos just for a moment while I happened to be dressed as a pirate. When I told him I was a seasteader, he said, "Oh yeah, I heard about you guys. We'd be happy to deliver whatever you guys need out there." Businessman, he didn't take any ideological stance. He immediately saw a customer. Right? So that's how it's going to work. Drones are getting more and more accurate and cheaper. And you can have drone deliveries delivered to things at your seastead. I think if you want your first step towards freedom outside territorial waters, you have to be a little more than 12 miles out. That's a ferry ride of probably less than a half hour. That's shorter than my commute from San Francisco to Silicon Valley. You don't have to go that far out to start running your businesses. Now, if you want complete freedom with no, you want to be probably outside the exclusive economic zone, which is 200 miles. But again, I think these things will scale up. I think they'll start close to land. They'll start to go a little bit further land as communities get established. It'll be like any society in the Midwest of the US. You guys are Americans, so I'll use American analogies. It's cheaper to get a cruise ship 200 miles out to sea or 1,000 miles out to sea than it is to get a truck full of food, full of fish from the coast into Chicago, or a plane flying in the really fresh fish. So I think this idea of being isolated, it's just like living in Hawaii. I mean, maybe some of your food will be a little bit more expensive, but Hawaii is pretty far from continental governments, and it does just fine.
Also, I noticed you were kind of touching on something there about the concept of piracy in that case. Now, some people have cited this as some type of concern, thinking that, Well, in this case, would people who live on seasteads be at greater risk of theft through pirates? Now, I don't really understand where this concern arises from, since I would say we're just as susceptible to theft, robbery as we are on land. I know in today's era of Amazon or things being shipped out, we have the common term of porch pirates now. It's something that can happen very easily, very frequently, and so I personally don't understand where exactly that concern would be from, but that does lead me to the question of how would seasteading necessarily secure one's own property and possessions?
To set the context, piracy is a land problem, not an ocean problem, even though it's defined as, a criminal on the sea. So I calculated that total piracy waters are less than 2% of all the ocean on the earth. And they're all in places off the coast of failed states or very poor states. So it's wherever an expensive cruise ship has to go by, usually a failed state or possibly Indonesia, and there's pirates that can race out from islands or from coastal states, capture your ship, and generally get paid by insurance companies to give up the people they've captured. So insurance companies work this into the business model for many ships. But over 98% of the oceans are pretty pirate free. I live in a American city. There are more criminals within a mile of this city than there are on the whole Pacific Ocean, within a mile of my home, than all the Pacific Ocean. People say that can't be true. And the example I use is French Polynesia, where seasteading tried to get started. French Polynesia controls an area of ocean the size of Western Europe. Not one piracy report has ever been recorded in its history. One was recorded in that area before French Polynesia was founded, but none in its entire history. So, when I'm in a European city and people ask me about pirates, I say you're more safe in an area of ocean the size of all Europe than you are in this very safe European city. But crimes do happen. Bad people are everywhere. They're even on cruise ships. There is a very sophisticated private security industry serving every type of vessel you can imagine on the oceans, employing every kind of innovation for every level of fear and safety. And you don't even notice that when you're on a ship, there are private security around. They're watching to make sure everything is okay. If you get in a fist fight on one of those party cruises, those guys will descend on you mighty fast. The captain, who is a tin pot dictator, is free to lock you in the brig with no trial and then abandon you on the next obscure island, and it's your problem. These are all market-driven dynamics. Ships have to go between Somalia and Yemen all the time. They have private security on board. Last I checked, no pirate has ever boarded a ship with private security on board. I'll get particularly provocative for you because seasteading already exists in the form of gun armories, floating armories. I always try to avoid mentioning this because I worry it's like a bad example. It'll strike people as a bad example of seasteading, but it's actually a good example of seasteading. So there are some waters that are just dangerous to bring your $100 million worth of cargo through. You want to have like 5 armed security guys on board to fire warning shots at any pirates that come to take over that ship, especially if they're coming out from Somalia or Yemen. But some of the ports you ride into don't allow guns. So in many cases, these ships, they pull up next to floating armories. They have to leave from a place where they're not allowed to have guns. Then they take a ferry ride to pick up the guns, get on the ship, and then they're armed for their passage. And then when they come within striking distance of the sophisticated country that doesn't allow guns to be brought on board, here's the scandalous part: they'll throw expensive automatic weapons overboard. That sounds like terrible for the environmentalists, but guns are largely made out of steel and they dissolve at sea. Over time, they'll they'll break down and go away at the bottom of the ocean, especially if the oceans are very deep. The point of telling this story is not to say I approve of this practice. It's to point out that people already seastead secretly all over the world for all sorts of various reasons, because of laws on land that don't make sense, for the businesses that are bringing us the vast wealth that keeps us prosperous. We don't even think about, this coffee I'm drinking right now. The beans were on the ocean a week or two ago. Most of what I'm looking at in this room, including much of what's on my computer, was shipped from overseas on a ship. And for all that cargo to be moving through all these dangerous places, those businesses do what they have to do. And in some cases, it involves permanent floating armories on the sea.
I've also said this is also a case against, a lot of the more statist arguments that are proposed against seasteading. So I found that basically in virtually every sense, no matter how we slice it, seasteading is founded upon preserving, property as well as wealth, and whether we're talking about privacy or through the taxation or inflation that's so prevalent on land. Many of the arguments for state control of law enforcement, for example, do fail to actually address the why government is necessary in this case. In this case, people are concerned that, there could be, security as far as law or any protection really, based upon the fact that it would be so inaccessible on the ocean. But what you're really laying out here is that that is in fact not the case. But having addressed this, what exactly would you say is just wrapping things up here, what is the biggest complaint that you've received from people who try to argue for the necessity of a centralized government and who express concern that seasteading is, in a sense, subverting that particular necessity?
The last remaining challenge is people's not understanding how realistic seasteading is, and that all these things they think of as people whose minds are landlocked, there are easy answers to all these questions. I would say the biggest challenge is persuading people that want to go to Mars or want to negotiate with governments for special economic zones that seasteading is much more practical, that we have a whole frontier here to move forward, and that this is what we should all be focused on if we actually care about governance innovation, because it's realistic, it's doable, it's not crazy. There's just a bunch of things you need to rethink. All your land assumptions, every paradigm you can think of, gets flipped by seasteading, right down to the sea pillar. So I don't see any real challenges to seasteading, except if the governments of the world all get together and decide to declare jurisdiction over all the oceans everywhere because they want to save the environment or something. I think if that happens, that's a real threat to seasteading. I think it's simply a matter of education and focusing the minds of people who are interested in liberty, focusing the minds that are already in the ocean industry who are interested in liberty, focusing the minds of people with capital that are trying to find a way to create startup governments. I've learned to ignore, I've found that probably 99% of people that say, what about pirates? Well, it's going to be like Waterworld. Well, what about waves? Well, what about tsunamis? Well, what about hurricanes? And as you answer all those questions, they move on to the next challenge. Those people, they're not actually interested in the answers to the questions. They're trying to find something wrong with seasteading. And then the question becomes like, why are you trying to find something wrong with seasteading? You have an ideology that doesn't like the idea of people trying a new government. And the reason those people should be persuaded is that seasteaders are putting all their own skin in the game. We're not getting tax money. We're not asking for grants. We're going to build these things ourselves. We're going to run our own businesses. We're going to do it before the eyes of the world. And if it fails, all the people that don't like us can laugh at the fiascos. And it's only the successes that can end up nourishing the rest of the world with new ideas, just as Hong Kong originally did for China, just as the New World in North America originally did for the Old World in Europe. I like to point out to people, what's a value people like? Let's say voting rights for everybody. Well, where did that emerge? Did it come top down from government leaders who decided they wanted to share power and be nice? No, it came from homesteading and competition among governments. The competition among the territories being established on the western frontier, they had the problem where they needed to attract more people to live there. Crucially, they needed to attract women to move out there. So they started providing voting rights. They provided voting rights to former slaves. They provided voting rights to Chinese. They needed them to get out there to build things. They started providing voting rights to all ethnicities, one man, one vote. And most radically, they ended up providing voting rights to women. The territory of Wyoming offered complete unqualified voting rights to women in 1869. The original voting rights for women that were always qualified in certain areas that were considered feminine, that started generations before that. Voting rights for disenfranchised minorities, including whites who didn't own property, that all started on the western frontier, and it didn't become accepted by the whole nation until 1920, which is several generations before it was developed among competing polities on the frontier. So I can talk about the Italian Renaissance. I can talk about ancient Greece. The real place for governance innovation emerges among competing governments competing for citizens. Happens over and over in history. It emerges from the bottom up. And if we can do that on the ocean, seasteads will be a technology to unleash that kind of innovation from the bottom up among people competing for other people's choices.
Yes. Yes, very true. And I think that's, a great note for us to conclude on. Man has always lived along the ocean, but has historically made very little use of it in the grand scheme of things. And I do see that seasteading, if nothing else, does seem to finally mark a change in this particular trend. So I'm somebody who's immensely curious as to how this will unfold, and I'm somebody who's definitely hoping for the best here, because I really do want to. I would definitely like to live on at least experience, some time on a seastead in the future. So I am wishing the best on that. And with that said, I do want to thank the audience for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. Go ahead and follow the Seasteading Institute. Make sure to read Joe's book and donate to its cause at seasteading.org. So everybody out there, make sure to subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. Bye-bye.